record now. Okay, thank you everybody for coming today. I'm Joan Van Beesler, and I'm the Director of Unitarian Universalist Justice Ohio, and I'm the chair of the registration team with NOVOC, the Nonpartisan Ohio Voter Outreach Committee. Maria, introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria Bruno. I work for the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, and I run the Ohio Votes program, which is a Get Out the Vote program specifically designed to reach out to underserved Ohio voters. And I chair the steering committee for the Nonpartisan Ohio Voter Outreach Committee.
And I want to start us with just a little inspiration from John Lewis before we dive into this. He says that freedom is not a state, it is an act. It's not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest, but rather freedom is the continuous action we all must take. And each generation must do its part to create an even more fair and more just society. So with that in mind, just to tell you all today that this is a conversation. It's going to be kind of an open conversation because some of the things we'll talk about, we just heard like 15 minutes ago on a press conference on the Ohio channel with the Secretary of State, Frank LaRose. So we're going to do a little conversation about some of the common questions that we've heard already about registering to vote and then voting by mail, the absentee ballot process, and provide some additional information and resources for you all so that you have what you need when you're engaging or educating others in your community, or if you're phone banking, for example, or doing drive-through registration work. So that's what we're aiming for today. And we'll get started with a little video of Maria giving a rundown of this in very brief form. That is also on the UJO website and the NOVOC website, and you can use it.
So here's the quick and dirty on how to register yourself and your friends and family to vote in Ohio. First of all, there are a couple different ways you can register. You can register to vote online or by completing a paper form. If you have an Ohio ID or license, you can actually register to vote right online. You can visit ohvotes.org anytime, any day, and quickly check whether your voter registration is up to date. If you don't have an Ohio ID or driver's license, or if you just prefer paper forms, you can still fill out a voter registration paper form. Now let's talk about who is able to register to vote. The rules are pretty simple. 1, you must be 18 years or older by election day. So if you're 17 and your birthday is next week, you're in luck. You can register to vote as soon as today, and you'll be properly on the rolls for the November election. Next, you must be a U.S. citizen. And finally, you must not be currently incarcerated with a felony conviction. But if you have a felony conviction, you are still allowed to vote. So if you're in a halfway house, if you are still doing community service, if you're on probation or parole, all of you can still register to vote and cast your ballot in November. But when you've been convicted of a felony, you will be automatically removed from the voter registration rolls, which means you'll need to re-register to be properly registered for the November election. So tell your friends, tell your family, you can vote with a felony conviction. And of course, you must be an Ohio resident. Specifically, you must have lived here for at least 30 days prior to Election Day. If you have any trouble registering to vote or casting your ballot, call the Nonpartisan Voter Protection Hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. Happy voting!
That's a cute little 2-minute video. I love it. Maria, if you want to go through some slides with us on voting, and then we'll get into the absentee, which may be some more questioning and discussion.
Yeah, so I haven't watched that video in a while, but I at one point was watching that like 47 times in a row, so I'm getting flashbacks to that. So yeah, so I just covered these set of rules here. One thing to note is that we do have a vote in jail program. If people are either convicted of a misdemeanor or awaiting trial but still incarcerated, they are allowed to vote. The problem is, of course, getting them the materials and information to do so. So ACLU and All Voting is Local, they do some outreach specifically around the jails, and ACLU has a voting in jail toolkit. And All Voting is Local does trainings and such around jail voting. So if that's something that you're interested in, you have that opportunity. I hate this picture. So this is a voter registration form that has some of the sort of marked the most common errors or just some of the most important things to know. So first off, you have to update your address. Even if you move down the road, you have to update your address to your new address. Makes sense, logical. You can put your former address or not on the form. As far as my understanding is, they'll both of them will be processed just as equally. It might be a little bit easier for the administrators at the Board of Elections to process it if they also have your former address, but ultimately they'll match you with either your Ohio ID or social security number, so they'll know it's you and they'll update your voter registration. Phone number is not required, but if there were to be a question about your ballot or your voter registration, it's nice to have that number so that folks can reach out to you and find you if they need you. Also, when we on the nonprofit side of things, if we have a phone number, we'll actually text them hey, FYI, elections this week, here's your polling location, here's a number for questions, just a simple reminder to vote. And Joan, I think a couple slides over I have, yeah, okay, so yeah. If you want to go back to the common errors.
Yep.
So first is the most common error is that they're incomplete. One thing I want to note is that you may not write on the form after the voter walks away. The voter needs to be present for every marking on that form, which means if there's something left blank, even if it's totally logical, if it's like, you know, it's Columbus, I know it's Franklin County, that's too bad. There are some mistakes that if they're left blank, they'll still be able to process it. Others, they won't. I can tell you for a fact that date and signature and either the driver's license or social security, those ones will absolutely not be processed if they don't have that information 100% of the time. So while others you might be able to slip in still if they can sort of derive all of the information. One, they have the right to throw it out if they feel like it. And two, you're really relying on sort of the goodwill and a little bit extra effort from the Board of Elections, which, you know, especially during the presidential years might be more than they have. But some of the most common errors are just leaving forms blank in those particular spots. Others are reading county as country. You would be surprised how often this happens. People write USA, but you're supposed to put your county there. Or they'll leave it blank because they don't know. So if you're talking to someone, you know, who might not know their county, you can pull up a list of like the counties and cities, and so you can tell them which county they're in. Birth dates and today's dates, they sometimes invert. So they'll put your birthday where your today's day should go, and they put today's date where your birthday should go, which is very confusing. And then it has to be your voting address. It cannot be a PO box. It has to be a physical location. Technically, it could be any physical location. Technically, you could register at the park bench on 3rd and Broad. But, you know, that's not really going to help you get mail there. And it's certainly going to potentially make it more of a headache for either you and or the poll worker down the road to figure that out. And so we'll talk a little bit about like what address to use, especially for homeless voters or transient voters in a second. But these are the most common mistakes that we see. And legibility is obviously important. You are welcome to help them fill out the form, which is another thing that we'll cover, but that's, you know, make sure you can read it and that the average person could read it.
There's a question about whether you can abbreviate the county.
I believe yes. And actually, frankly, my understanding is most folks who leave that blank will still have their form processed, but again, it's just not worth the risk. But
yes, you can abbreviate. I would say the safest thing to do ultimately, though, is just spell it out and not deal with that.
Now, what is the difference if they register online?
What's the difference?
Yeah. Is there a difference in what's asked for if they
Oh,
register
okay. So,
online?
yeah. So if you're registered online or registering online, you have to have a physical Ohio ID. That's the form of ID that they accept. So if you rely on using your social security number because you don't actually have an ID, then you can't register online, unfortunately, under this current set of rules because you won't have that ID number. So you'll have to fill out a paper form.
They have to fill out a paper form. That was a little hard to hear. If you don't have an Ohio ID, if you register online, you have to have an Ohio ID and your social security number.
Right.
Otherwise, paper. Okay.
And so this is the form just blown up a little bit. Those first questions 1 and 2, a lot of people's eyes, for whatever reason, will just skip those boxes and start right at last name. So just make sure that they actually, check yes, check yes. The other thing that is can be helpful to note is if you're talking with someone whose immigration status might be more in question, you can use the form to guide the discussion so that you're not as aggressively putting them on the spot if you're asking about their citizenship, right? So, if you're not sure, you can be like, okay, so, let's fill out this form. You'll notice the first question is, are you a U.S. citizen? Are you a U.S., and so then you're asking on behalf of the form and not saying, hey, what's your citizenship? And that can provide them sort of the wiggle room that they need if they're not a citizen to feel comfortable leaving the conversation. And of course, it also helps, both of you all kind of not waste your time if they don't have citizenship because they're not eligible to vote, unfortunately. This is the previous address. Like I said, my understanding is the most forms that are change of addresses will still be processed even if you don't put the previous address, but if you know it, it makes it helpful and simpler and less likely to have some clerical error in the process. Signature, make sure they sign and date it. Some people will do one or the other. They need to have both. Next slide. So this is the form that I sort of marked up in my very homemade circles. But you can see the marks where the most common mistakes happen. So county, not country. A lot of people try to leave the driver's license number, social security number blank. Birthday or today's date, they'll confuse. They'll forget to sign it altogether. Or they might mix up the first and last name just because they write out their form, their name sort of first name, last name, like most people do most of the time, but in this case, it's last name, first name. Next slide. So you can help the voter fill out the form up until they need the signature. So if the voter is able to sign their own voter registration form, even if you write every single other word on that form, your name doesn't need to go anywhere on it. If they fill it out themselves, obviously your name does not need to go on the form. If the voter is not able to sign their own name, that's when you need to put your own name on that form so that you are serving as essentially a witness that that voter actually intended to register. So if there were to be any questions of legitimacy, they know who to track down. So on the next slide, I have kind of an example of what that looks like. So if you were to have someone who cannot sign their own form, you would either write their voter name or put an X, and then you would print the helper name underneath that. And actually, I think when I transferred the slides over, it made it a little icky. Make sure both are in the box, but you'll print your own name, and so then you're just kind of allowing people to track, what happened and how if the voter does not have their own signature on that form, which makes sense. Next slide. What address did you use? So back to the question about the park bench. Don't use a PO box. It has to be a physical location. One thing that I want to print on my forehead is that your address of your state ID does not need to match your voter registration address. I myself have gotten into arguments with coworkers about this very question because some will forget the rule, and I'm like, nope, that's not the rule. So that's something really important to note on a voter rights perspective, because especially college students or especially low-income folks who move a lot, like that is very likely to come up. And if they do have a driver's license, a lot of people will use the driver's license because it's kind of the easiest form to just use. And so they might be pushed to fill out a provisional ballot when they really are entitled to a regular ballot. If you're homeless or don't have a permanent address, especially with the eviction crisis, we see this is going to be an issue. Voters are still allowed to register and cast their ballot, but a couple things to point out. First, you can use a nonprofit, get their permission, but if they have like a shelter that they stay at a lot, or if there's just a nearby church to the park bench they sleep on, you know, something down the road, they can use that address for their voter registration and collect their mail at that nonprofit. Did have a couple people in the past get advised incorrectly. So they were like, someone called and asked, and they were like, well, why don't you just find a building nearby and register there? And it was a corporate building, and the corporation was like, what the heck? And, you know, then there were questions of voter fraud, and it was just a huge headache. So don't do that. And, you know, keep in mind that poll workers or election people answering the phones at the Board of Elections might not know that off the top of their head and might guide you incorrectly. But if a voter is evicted, for instance, if you know, they're then staying on their mom's couch, well, if that's where they're staying, that's where they're staying for the purposes of voting. So they can register at that couch. Oftentimes, if people don't think about this until election day, they ask, where should I vote? And I very precisely tell them, go vote where you are registered to vote, because that is where you will be allowed to vote. Another thing to note, if you are registering at an address where you might not have a valid ID for, so like if you're staying at your mom's couch, you probably don't have a utility bill. Voting early and or by absentee, you only need the last 4 digits of your social security number. So I highly, highly recommend that anyone that's in that boat to vote early or by absentee so that they can just avoid that headache altogether. And then college students can use either address, they just have to pick one. They also cannot register at one and show up to the other. So if they're living on campus and they want to keep their voter registration in their hometown where their parents live, that's totally fine, but then they'll have to vote by absentee or literally go home to vote. They can't just show up at their polling location at their college and try to vote their ballot the other way. Bye.
Any questions about that one? Because that one's always a little confusing, especially with people being evicted and sleeping on couches. Okay, good.
Okay, someone asked a good question about a driver's license. That they forced her to use the maiden name and as a middle name on it, and she's registered to vote just using the middle initial. Should I re-register with the maiden name included, even the voted absentee, and use my social security number as an ID? Frankly, I would. I think technically, like, that would be in the ballpark of like lawyers would fight about that question. So I would say in an election year where there is a high turnout and high skepticism about voting and voters, you're going to have an easier time if you just stick to whatever, one name along the way so that each step of the process matches. I would think that if it's like N for, Nichols, and Nichols is your maiden name and you only have N, I would think that that would be totally fine. But once again, people could disagree with me. And every time, that's the case, then you might be dealing with someone that's arguing that you shouldn't be allowed to, your vote shouldn't be allowed to count. So we can avoid that by just, especially since you're conscious of it, I would do our best to match up those names.
Yep,
okay.
Register. And here's one, Ohio State ID number. Can it be used if it is expired?
No. So is this effective? That's actually a very good question, and I don't have the answer, but I think that's where I will follow up, because that's a great question. Is the BNB interruptions might affect folks' expiration date. So the general rule in the past has been you cannot use an expired ID, but I will look into whether the shutdowns affect that. I think that's a really important question, and thank you for flagging that.
seen any, I haven't seen any rulings on that one. So that's a
I
great.
haven't either, but I also have to believe that they might just not be thinking about it. So, you know, if we bring it up, that gives them the opportunity to kind of make that work. The other thing is, just for the purpose of the other IDs like bills and stuff, current is within 12 months. So if it's within the calendar year, then it is a valid form of, it's considered current for the sake of voter ID rules.
Yep.
Okay, a couple questions that we just get a lot of. Can we pay for postage? It's an open question of law. We do know of a nonprofit that has sent a bunch of mailers with prepaid postage. They have yet to, you know, sort of get in, quote unquote, get in trouble for doing that. It's my personal belief that under the letter of the law, they are totally within their rights to send the prepaid postage. But if you were to ask another lawyer, they might give you a different answer. I know that's a really frustrating response, but it's just, that's the answer. So, you know, proceed at your own risk, I guess is what I would say. I would be skeptical that the Secretary of State's going to make a priority out of prosecuting, or I'm sorry, the AG's office is going to be making it a priority to prosecute, you know, nonprofits who are providing a stamp to their community. But weirder things have happened, and technically each of the county prosecutors would be within their rights to interpret the bribery statute as they see fit and prosecute accordingly.
Is that the same for absentee ballot request postage as opposed to the ballots themselves?
So,
sorry.
So here's an interesting sort of fact is to return an absentee ballot, the literal ballot, only a family member can do that, immediate family member. To return an absentee ballot request form, anyone can do that. So if you are a nonprofit that's helping folks navigate the voting process, you can mail the absentee ballot forms on their behalf. Could you put postage on the absentee ballot and then let them mail it is the open question of law, which shows you, again, how arbitrary that would be to decide that that's illegal. Once again, weird year, you know, reasonable minds could differ. So I would say that you can definitely pay, or you can definitely turn in absentee ballot request forms on behalf of voters. You may not return ballots on behalf of voters, but you can give them a ride to go drop off their ballot. So if, you know, you run into a situation where someone needs that, you can just give them a ride, but they have to be present. And so I think in that vein, the closer you get to an actual ballot, the stickier the chances of someone else objecting to that also get closer.
And given that we only have one drop box now in each county for absentee ballots to be returned by hand, the idea of forming some volunteer assistance to put people in the back of your car and take them to the drop box becomes something that might be incredibly valuable to their enfranchisement.
And I think Carol just asked, any chance the number of drop boxes may still change? Based on the press conference that we just had an hour ago, I would say highly, highly unlikely.
Yep.
The Secretary of State's position seems to be that unless there's explicit authority given from the General Assembly, they won't provide any additional drop boxes. Yeah, so.
And that's totally his purview.
That's the answer.
That's the answer. We do have a question too. How old do you have to be to help somebody complete a voter registration form? Is that the same 17-year-old? And then.
So actually anyone of any age can help. The only addendum to that is they cannot have specifically been guilty of an election law violation, which they'll know. And two, they have not been convicted of a felony after May 2006. And again, very random. It's the result of litigation and directives and all of that stuff, and that's just how the rules shook out. But other than that, anyone of any age can help complete the ballot on someone else's behalf. Returning paper registration forms. The registration forms must be returned within 10 days of completion. So the easiest way that we found to do it is a weekly sweep. So if you have a more passive collection where you're like, you know, at the front desk, you have people collecting forms or whatever, that's fine. Just every Friday, collect them all, mail them all in, and then, you'll still be within that 10-day mark. And they also need to be returned by registration deadline is when it's received by the Board of Elections. So with the mailing being the way that it is, keep that in mind. And then within 20 business days of receiving the voter registration form, and again, all of these windows are subject to prompt delivery via the USPS, so keep that in mind. But within 20 days of them receiving it, they'll send out a verification that it was processed and confirmation that you're registered.
And you can check this online with the State of Ohio tracker system, and I believe we have that URL later on in the slides.
This is our voter registration tool that we have online. The reason that we go through ohvotes.org is that we're actually able to study voting patterns of the underserved communities that we reach out to through this. So we're able to match that person with their voter file and actually see, find larger voting patterns and see how effective the work we're doing is. The other thing we do is we can follow up with voters who went through us, but maybe didn't get properly registered after doing so.
I was going to say, and those of you doing phone banking, just know that we have already updated ohvotes.org, and you can take a look at that. And we may be putting in another update that will make it easier for you to walk people through the processes of registration and getting an absentee ballot application. And we're working on that one right now. So that may be another upgrade that would come in another week or so.
Voter purges, I think you guys probably know the basics here. Voter rolls are updated to reflect either people having moved or having passed away. The rationale is that, of course, we just have to every once in a while double check the list, which makes sense. But unfortunately, what we've found is that without a centralized auditing system, which the Secretary of State does not have, there are a lot of mistakes on the voter purge rolls. So if someone is inactive for 2 years, they'll get a notice from the Secretary of State saying, hey, you haven't been active. We want to make sure your registration is still where you live. And then if they don't respond, then after a cumulative of 6 years, but 4 years after that 2-year mark, they will be removed from the rolls. If they either don't vote or they don't reach back out to the Secretary of State's office. The big criticism has obviously been if people, for instance, people who the last time they voted was for Obama, they would have been purged by this point. So that just gives you a sense for, yes, there's an important element of keeping rolls up to date, but there's also the realistic element that not all voters vote in every election as much as we might want them to, which lines us up for otherwise eligible voters getting unfairly removed from the rolls. And he has said that he will do another round of purging after this year's election, but not before.
But after. And Carol Anderson, who writes a great deal and researches about voter suppression, urges people actually to check their voter registration status weekly, because there are glitches in the system. Even well-meaning folk can make computer glitches, as we've seen, and Maria has said. We got a couple questions here. How can folks sign up to get invitations to things like this webinar without being on Facebook? If they're part of the NOVOC volunteer sign up, we sent invitations out to that. Or if they were on UU Justice Ohio database, we send out invitations to that. But the NOVOC sign up will certainly get an invitation to webinars like this.
And it also depends on who's putting on the webinar, but also what the goal of the webinar. So this was specifically for folks who were, volunteering to reach out to vulnerable voters, because we found that there are a lot of common questions, and we wanted it to be an informal conversation. I know I'm like giving a presentation, but you know, we wanted to be able to have break for these back and forths and answer, you know, the most pertinent questions coming up in your phone banking and all of that.
Oh, and somebody asked about the online update that we're creating. Would that get you a request for an absentee ballot online? It will take you to the absentee ballot application, which can be filled out by PDF, printed, and mailed. There is no absentee ballot application that can be submitted online, and there won't be from the
And
last.
that doesn't exist. It's not that our
doesn't
website doesn't
exist.
link to it. It doesn't exist. That you
It just,
cannot request absentee online only.
right. And as far as You the Vote goes, we don't have a mailing database on that one. Okay. I mean, it's the UJO database. Okay.
But this is why we recommend that even people who believe they're otherwise registered should verify their registration frequently, so that when they go to vote, they know it's up to date and there hasn't been a clerical error of some sort.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm taking my dog into my bedroom.
And this is a picture of what ohvotes.org looks like. Okay.
Yep. And since we switched the site over, it's slightly different colors, but it's still substantially the same.
And voter forms and absentee ballots.
Yeah. So one thing, especially if you're doing a program in person, I want to note that a lot of folks, especially folks in the low-income community, actually NOVA, Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates, did a study in 2016, and it was like 15 to 20% of low-income voters who requested an absentee ballot got rejected because they weren't registered. So a lot of people think that either one, that their registration is, you know, the same for, they haven't moved for 18 years, I assume it's still valid. That might not be true. But the other thing is some people believe that requesting an absentee ballot is the same thing as registering to vote, or they believe functions as both. So before you allow, you know, so if you're passing out absentee ballot request forms, which is a great way to do community outreach, check their voter registration first so that we know that they're they have a valid registration and they don't waste their time requesting absentee ballot and then getting denied, because what happens is they don't find that out until after the registration deadline. So make sure you check their voter registration first. And if they are not registered, you can submit their voter registration and absentee ballot request at the same time. So you can go ahead and just have them do both, and you know, they should be good to go.
And put a paper clip on them. Don't staple them together, but
Yeah.
put a paper clip on them. Okay.
Okay. So voting options in person on election day. So far, nothing of related to election day voting has changed. Will there be polling sites consolidation or some last minute changes? There's always the risk of that. And we do anticipate that the risk's a little higher this year because of COVID. But as of right now, proceed as usual. We don't, you know of any other changes. It'll be their standard vote at their polling location. Early in person, same thing. It'll be at their early vote location, which is usually their Board of Elections. The Secretary of State has like a master calendar, as does our ohvotes.org. So if you're looking just for like the key dates and the dates for early voting, that's where you can find them. And then absentee voting, you can request an absentee ballot today, sooner the better. There's only going to be one drop box per county. We got confirmed today that that's going to stay that way. So that's probably at the Board of Elections as well. So again, if you want to be helpful to folks you work with, you can offer to give them a ride to drop off that ballot. And then if it's mail, it has to be postmarked by November 2nd. And technically you have till the Saturday before the election to request it. But I honestly barely even like sharing that information, because you should request it at least 2 weeks before election day. So while that is technically an option and we might like to procrastinate as individuals, I highly, highly, highly discourage that you wait until the last week before election day to request an absentee ballot.
And if you have an absentee ballot and you want to mail it from home, allow at least 10 days. because of the time that it takes now with the post office, and the fact that the post office has consolidated all of their sorting processing plants now. They are all in Ohio, but it takes a longer time. And so you have to allow, I believe, 10 days from what I have been hearing from post office officials if you mail it from home. If you take it to a post office, you can take it in and have it stamped right there with the postmark, and then and do that by November 2nd. Okay. Any questions about that?
Someone asked, wasn't the Secretary of
Oh, yeah.
State going to move the vote by mail request deadline? He doesn't believe it's within his power to do so. So he would like the General Assembly, the legislature, to do that in a bill form. I don't see that happening in any realistic world. So he would like that. Honestly, most voter advocates would also like that. But it's not going to happen this year.
So he's recommending, and he recommended publicly,
Mm-hmm.
that you do it well in advance.
Yeah.
Okay. Alternative voting options. Oh, suddenly hospitalized.
Yeah, so this more than other years is like just something to know. If someone is suddenly hospitalized, there is a method for them to vote, and this outlines just what it is. But largely, you just have to tell them by 3 p.m., which polls close at 7:30. So that makes sense. And then if you're hospitalized at a different county, you should be able to get your county board elections to fax over your ballot. Disability Rights Ohio does a lot of question and answering around this topic because, of course, their community is very impacted by it. But this is just something to know that it exists. You might not know it exists because how often is it really utilized, but it is an option.
Oh, and can you get an absentee ballot application by walking into a board of election during the office hours that they might have? Yes.
Yes. And actually most, or at least some libraries will also have.
And then, whoops, pardon me.
Are the local hospitals walking patients through this process? I assume you're referring to emergency voting. I would be surprised if the local hospitals even know that exists, and actually it might be a good educational campaign to make them aware of it, but I would be highly doubtful that they will even know how to do that if asked.
Chaplains know, and chaplains have walked people through this. I can speak from experience. So when in doubt, or patient advocates.
Yeah. Voting locations are required to be handicap accessible. On election day, Disability Rights Ohio has a hotline. We always have the election protection hotline, which you can also call, but it should have either handicap accessible location or curbside voting. And actually the Secretary of State is recommending that they all have curbside voting because of COVID. But also something to note is that people often ask, they think that no one can help them by going into the polls. And they can. So either they can request 2 precinct election officials, which will be a Democrat and Republican, or they can bring someone with them. And the only people that they can't bring in with them are a candidate, their employer, or a union agent. In other words, they cannot bring someone who might have a reason or ulterior motive to pressure them to vote a certain way when they vote. So it makes sense that they have those limitations.
Family members are best.
Yeah.
Hey, absentee ballot applications.
Absentee ballot applications. So the Secretary of State's going to mail them out around Labor Day. Under current law, they can't be submitted online in any way. They need the signature, so they must be printed out and mailed. SB 191 is one of the bills that we kind of referenced earlier that would allow online absentee ballot requests to be passed. Based on the press conference today, LaRose is not going for that. I think the wording he used was it would blow a hole in their online security system, which was hyperbole to say the least. But I don't see that happening because that's the position of the Secretary of State. So Center for Voter Information mailed out a bunch of pre-filled absentee ballot applications and confused everyone. This is a nonpartisan nonprofit. It is an acceptable form. If you were to fill it out and send it in, it would be processed accurately, but it was not mailed specifically from the government or the Board of Elections, and that's just important to know. Because a lot of people, what I've found, this might, it's great from an accessibility standpoint, but it also creates a lot more confusion. So like I've had a few people reach out, for example, that are like, I already requested an absentee ballot. Why am I getting an absentee ballot request form in the mail? So that's just one of the reasons that they might be confused, especially if on top of that, it kind of looks like maybe it came from the Board of Elections. So if you get questions about that, that might be what's happening. And so just know the form will be accepted if they choose to use it, but it is not sent from the government, and it might not reflect their current most up-to-date absentee ballot stage in the absentee ballot request process.
And please note that this nonprofit sent out 1.8 million, and they were pre-filled with name. Mm-hmm. But there's 7.8 million absentee ballot request forms going out from the Secretary of State. So that's a huge difference.
So the question was, did the Center for Voter Info mass mail only go to currently registered voters? So the absentee ballot request form, yes, but I actually got it, which I am registered to vote, I promise, guys. But I got a letter from them that said our records indicate someone in your household is not registered to vote, and it had a voter registration form. I also talked to the Secretary of State about that form to see if it was an acceptable form, and it is. But again, it could be confusing for folks. So the absentee ballot request form only went to registered voters, but if they are not registered, they might still get a communication asking them to register.
This is what one of the letters looks like, the Center for Voter Information.
And they're also the group that kind of says, like, you vote less than your neighbor, which is a very controversial persuasion tactic that I personally have problems with, but they claim it works, so they use it. But yeah, so if you get some weird letter, that's where it's from, and that's why they're doing it.
They mean well, they are kosher, but.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a lot of confusion over the mail-in ballot process. When to apply, you can apply whenever, but a lot of people will say, okay, I applied 3 weeks ago, where's my ballot? The ballots aren't even finalized until early October, so they will be mailed in early October. So even if you request it today and it's on file and your request was accepted, that's wonderful. You will be set up to get mail in October. And then when you return it, it technically needs to be postmarked by Monday, November 2nd. A couple things to note. First, of course, is all of the headache with the USPS. We would definitely recommend giving more time than that. The other thing is that some of the other voting advocates have pointed out that just the way that the post office now sorts their mail, it's not always postmarked at all. Sometimes they'll just postmark the top of the stack and then send them on their way. And so your ballot might not get a postmark. So if you are really running close to that deadline, I would highly recommend using the Dropbox or dropping it off on election day or just mailing, way earlier. But something also to note is that you have all of election day to drop it off in person, but the postmark has to be from the day before election day. Another thing to note is that they cannot go to their polling location and turn this in. They have to go to the Board of Elections and or the Dropbox, which is usually the same place. So they can't just go to their regular polling location and say, here's my ballot, I'm good to go. What they can do is they can go to their polling location and vote provisionally, and then once it is confirmed by the Board of Elections that they didn't also turn in a mail-in ballot, that vote will be counted. Again, that's creating a lot more trouble than it's worth. So that I also like pointing out that if someone does plan on voting early, don't gratuitously request an absentee ballot. It creates more of a headache for them. It creates more of a headache for the election administrators. If you request an absentee ballot, make sure that's how you want to vote. But there are some sort of contingency options if you get in a situation where you haven't, it's Tuesday, you haven't mailed your ballot. What do I do? You can walk to your polling location, vote provisionally, and then have that vote counted once it's confirmed you didn't also mail your ballot.
Now, this slide has the fact that there may be multiple drop boxes. Forget that sentence, okay? Because that changed 45 minutes ago. So there are not going to be multiple drop boxes. There will be one drop box in each county where you can take the absentee ballot. And the post office folk have initiated special post office police inspectors actually, to keep looking at each of the sorting centers to make sure that the official ballots are actually being processed and shipped out properly. And I do know that many of the postal employees in the postal union has said that they will postmark the ballots. But truth of the matter is, there's a lot of people, or a lot of ballots coming through, a lot of people mailing in their ballots, we expect, and there's very few postal employees, and that number keeps decreasing. So, and there are new people coming in as subs all the time. So we have to keep that
Joan
one in mind.
pointed out a great point as well, is you can actually go to the post office and request a postmark. So
Yes.
if you are concerned about that and have time to do that, that's another option.
Can I ask a quick question just for my edification, which is in the last 45 minutes, you got this ruling for Dropbox, one Dropbox per county. Can you just, and I'm sorry to do this, but so we can keep it short, but what was the line of reasoning for that decision?
I think a lot of the line of reasonings for any of the lack of changes or, lack of changes really is that I think LaRose is really not trying to act without the explicit permission of the General Assembly on anything, because his theory that he's stating is that he might not have the authority and doesn't want to put himself in the middle of a situation that he doesn't have authority to make a decision he doesn't have authority to make. Frankly, I think the bigger problem is that the primary was such a mess that he really doesn't want to be in an adversarial relationship with the General Assembly members anymore. So I think it's a little bit of chickening it out, maybe. But the general reasoning is it's not his decision.
There's also time and money and fear of lawsuits that could put some of the counting of ballots into question, he says. So.
Someone asked if there's concern about insufficient postage. My understanding is the general policy of the post office is that they will deliver election-related mail regardless of whether postage is sufficient. We don't advertise that because we don't want everyone trying to mail without a stamp. But my general understanding is if it is election, if it's a ballot or absentee ballot, they're going to mail it properly and deliver it to the Board of Elections, even if there is insufficient postage.
The Board of Elections won't pay for it, but the post office will deliver it. They have said that they would deliver it.
And again, that's an accommodation made by the USPS that
right.
Maybe there's a directive tomorrow that says they're not allowed to do that.
Right. But or encourage people to put at least 2 stamps on. I don't know if any of our ballots are going to be large enough to require 3, but assume at least 2. Okay.
Just wanted to double check about going to vote absentee provisionally if you did request an absentee. That's the law. So if someone is telling you otherwise or is acting otherwise, please call the Election Protection Hotline and report that incident so that we can follow up and either correct the information or, check out the situation in general. So, but they have a right to cast a ballot. So even if they requested one, they should be able to vote. Every single person in the world is allowed to vote provisionally on election day. They sort out who gets counted on the back end via lawyers and all of that. But if you go to vote at a minimum, you should be able to vote provisionally.
Okay. And this is just what the request form looks like. And here's some common errors on the vote by mail, the absentee ballot request form. Noting your birthday, not today's date up there. Don't forget apartment numbers, county, not country, the address where you're registered to vote, address where you would like your ballot mailed if different than above. Important for college students. The fact that it's a general election and not a primary, and you don't have to declare a party. Okay? And then don't forget to sign and date. The signature is what is key on this one. And then add your phone number and email so your Board of Election, if they get this early enough, they say they're going to contact folk that might have an error. So get it in early. Get it in now, today.
And put a phone number.
And put a phone number, yeah. Okay. And this is just
Oh, also
looking at it again. Yeah.
a note, yeah, another crazy sheet. Another note about putting your phone number, that the phone number will not be public record. While the voter file is public record, your ID number, social security number, and phone number are not part of that. So that will not be public record.
And it says so right on the bottom. Okay. And that's just another crazy thing that we're looking at. Okay. Ohio does have an online system that allows you to track. I have been able to track my absentee ballot application, and I know that it's in. And I know that come October 6th, they're going to mail the ballot out to me. Frank LaRose has also put in his ballot application. And so on October 6th, when they start mailing them out, we'll be first in line. And this is the tracking place, ballot tracking. That we should get a bit.ly developed for that, shouldn't we?
Ballot tracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the program will allow you to have texts or emails sent when the absentee ballot application is received by your Board of Election, when it's mailed to the voter, and when the absentee ballot is received back. So I signed up to get a text notification as well as email notification when it comes through. Okay. Just some quickies.
Yeah, just a couple things to note. People often ask like how COVID is affecting the election. Some of the biggest things are precinct worker shortage. So especially if you have young, healthy people in your life, it's an all-day commitment, but it's a really cool look in kind of the behind the curtain of our democracy. It's paid, and yeah, it's a great experience. And also, if you're a lawyer, you can get 4 hours of continued learning education credits, which is awesome. I know people who are very not interested in the election that are going to do it just for that reason alone. So that's a nice incentive. But, you know, if you have college students or high school, 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds, Joan?
17-year-olds, but they got to be 18 by the election.
Okay. So same rules. So if you have an 18-year-old high school student who's bored or wants to get involved, that's another option for them.
They have to be registered.
Increased stress on mail-in voting. You all know the basics of that. Increased voter confusion over rules, as this presentation shows. There's a lot of confusion, especially when we've sort of had the idea and had a lot of different ideas introduced, but not implemented. So a lot of people be like, I heard something about this, and then they think that's the rule now, but that was something so-and-so said in reaction to this bill, which wasn't passed, so there's just a lot more misconceptions about how the election is going to operate. So there will be a need for more clarification. And then there could be short notice changes. I think the biggest one is probably if they have to consolidate polling locations is probably going to be the most disruptive change close to election. But that's always the case. They always try to move locations, in the 12th hour. So we'll deal with it as we can.
And that's why we have volunteers now in many of the counties who are forming relationships with the Board of Elections, so that there is some feedback and accountability on how they consolidate those.
Someone asked about scratching out information on the form. Yeah. I think this is another, it depends who's reviewing the form. There's no hard and fast. If there's a scratch mark, it's not going to count. If 3/4 of the form is scratched out, that's going to raise some eyebrows. So they might have follow-up questions, or they might try to contact the voter. But just like I put a Q instead of a P and I crossed it out, I don't think that would be enough to throw out a form. I'd also say not in the signature box. The signature box is used for the polling books to match. So if you have a crossed out within the signature box, I would recommend redoing the whole form.
And they do check signatures twice. So that's why the absentee ballots.
When they check them. So
right.
And also Dan asked about HB 680 and 191. They're not even going to reconvene until September. So if either of those move, it's not going to be in time for the November election. So we're kind of not really, knock on wood, not having to worry about that.
There was going to be a Senate session in the middle of August, but they have canceled that. So nothing till mid-September, and that's way too late for any changes. But they might come for the next election. Mm-hmm. Okay. Other questions? You can unmute
I
yourself.
have one.
Yeah.
It's Sarah. I just had a little bit of a panic because I sent my absentee ballot to my school location, and now I'm thinking I might not be there in October given COVID. So should I vote provisionally if that happens, or can I forward the ballot?
I would think that what I would do if I were in that situation is I would call your Board of Elections and explain exactly that, because they're going to be very aware of that reality for a lot of folks this year, and I'm sure that they'll work with you to straighten it out. And it might be a matter of them mailing you a new form or asking you to mail a new form. But there's definitely still time to resolve that prior to Election Day. So I would just reach out to them and explain exactly what you just told us. And I'm going to imagine they're just going to say, we'll cancel this request and submit us another one. But let me know if that's not what they say, because I would be curious to hear that.
All right, but do it now before they get hit with the rush, because during the rush, the chances of getting something fixed go down exponentially.
And that could be a common thing that's going to happen with a lot of college students this fall.
Yeah. And is there any current planning to prepare for possible surge of evictions, foreclosures?
Great question. So we actually just made contact with some folks at the Legal Aid Society in Columbus, and we are hopefully starting next week going to pilot actually registering voters at those eviction court hearings. So they're saying, you know, hundreds of folks are being evicted per day, and they're unique individuals and they're low income individuals. So we are going to do our best to get voter registration opportunities literally in those in the convention center in Columbus to register voters while they're sitting waiting around and or just left, you know, a very traumatic hearing. And in that outreach, we are going to include information about their registration options. So whether it's a nonprofit nearby or whether it's their aunt's house, or, you know, depending on what their next move is, will determine what's the best answer. But we are hoping to get those folks before they even leave the building. And then we can ensure that they're still registered to vote, even if they were evicted. But great question.
Yep. Others?
Do we need to be doing that in every county, or is that going to already part of that plan, Maria?
Yeah, so we're going to pilot in Franklin County, get all of the, sort of hurdles straightened out, ironed out, and then the hope is that we would implement it in each county, or as many as we can cover. And so that's why we're trying to move so quickly on it. But we just want to make sure that, they'll actually let us in the building, and, we can actually do all of these things. And we know it'll vary around the state, as it always does, but hopefully if we can do a clean process within Columbus, we can then properly instruct other parts of the state how to do this work effectively.
We'd need some voter registration teams then that really understand the address situation and the complexities of that.
Yeah.
And we can do some training on that if we find that we are able to embed some folk. All right, others? Sorry we can't produce better news around some of the absentee ballot process issues, but we have what we have. And
Joan, do you want me to just, I assume you're going to make these slides available. If we want to just flip through the FAQs that I put at the end for people to have. So I just wanted to let you guys know that these are in the slides. They're probably not new information for you, but I just wanted sort of a reference if you do get questions. So this is what's on the ballot. The next slide is what 501c3s can and cannot do. The next slide is the election protection hotline number. Also note that there are other languages available. We just put the three main ones. Next slide is some ways to research your ballot. And then I think that's it. So
that's it.
Yeah, so that's just, I just wanted to kind of throw that information in there in case you guys found that to be helpful.
And since you registered for this, I will be sending the slides out to you in PDF format. If you need them in slide format to do your own PowerPoint, let me know and I'll send that out. Okay? All right. So if there's no other questions, then we are perfectly at 12:02, well, 2 minutes over. And I'm just going to close with a little bit then from Dorothy Day to kind of put a period on the sentence that we've had here. Because people do say, what's the sense of our small efforts? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time and take one step at a time, because a pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. And each one of our thoughts, words, deeds, voter registrations, and absentee ballot calls is like that, because no one has the right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. So thank you.